We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Howard Gale. Howard Gale is a lifelong activist. He came of age during Vietnam War protests and the struggle for farm workers, led Quaker work camps, was a founding member of the Northwest disarmament group Live Without Trident in the 70s, the Boston group Central America Solidarity Association in the 80s, the Northwest anti-war group SNOW, Sound Nonviolent Opponents of War, in the aughts, and helped set up the Abe Oshroff and Gunnell Clark Fund in Human Rights at the University of Washington. And he is here to talk about his lawsuit against the city of Seattle for withholding documents related to policies aimed at the homeless at Seattle Center. Howard, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you, Mike.
So start out, tell us about your lawsuit here with the city of Seattle.
Well, it started last May 2012, when I noticed that in the newly renovated portions of the Seattle Center House, what's now called the Armory, they had installed dozens of new outlets, AC outlets, and then within a matter of weeks started covering them all up, putting locking covers on them. And that seemed rather curious. Why would you go to the expense in a new renovation of putting in something that costs thousands of dollars and then spending thousands of dollars to cover it up? So I started asking at the information counter. I couldn't be given clear answers. September 2012, I talked with a number of the staff at Seattle Center. I talked with Mary Weidman-Williams, who's the chief operating officer. And again, I didn't get satisfactory information. What I was basically told is in the new renovation of Seattle Center, they're trying to make it more accessible to a wider range of people, which didn't really make sense to me. And what I suspected is it was an attempt to push out the homeless. The homeless, Seattle Center, the Center House is a unique place that allows people to come with their belongings, bring their laptops, their phones, their radios, plug them in, charge them, actually hang out with friends. It provides wireless internet access so people can look for services. It's a place of mutual support. People share, spend all day there. And you can't do that in a library. You can't do that anywhere else. So having access to AC outlets is really critical in that kind of an environment. And it seemed mean-spirited that Seattle Center was not just closing off the new outlets, but as it turned out over the late spring and summer of 2012, they were actually going around shutting out every outlet in the entire building. And so as a result of that, I started asking questions in the fall, and that resulted in a public records request because I thought I wasn't getting the full story. And sure enough, when I got some of the public records in in November, it turned out that it was part of an effort to push the homeless out of Seattle Center. Covering up the AC outlets is one aspect. Another aspect was trying to promulgate new rules and regulations for behavior. And they spent a year struggling with how do we discriminate against people without looking like we're discriminating. But I think they thought that the AC outlets was the most effective way to push homeless people out. If they simply denied them access, they would move on to other locations. And I have an email in which they actually say to the homeless, in a meeting with homeless representatives, they actually say, why don't you go to other places? There are libraries nearby. So that was the genesis of the suit, is that they released some of the information, but a very, very small portion of it.
So is Seattle Center, is that considered like a public park? Is that the Commons?
It's a city-owned facility, and it is treated as a park. So everyone has equal access. Just like in a park, you can't engage in any kind of commercial behavior unless you actually have permission, you have a special contract or license. But access is unrestricted, just like it would be in a park. And whatever services or amenities are available are equally available to everyone. So unlike a business, Seattle Center doesn't have the right to simply say, you're not buying something here, please leave. So that's why, for Seattle Center, one of the things that I noticed is after the renovation, so starting in the spring, summer, and fall of 2012, after the renovation, there was more security guards. They were being a little more aggressive when they would go over to homeless people that put their heads down or seemed to be nodding out. Now, what's interesting about that is in more than one instance, I noticed the private security that they have there, go over to a homeless person who would put his head down and tell them to wake up, that they couldn't sleep there. When 5 tables away, there was an entire family that had their heads on a table and were completely asleep. And they never got any kind of, warning or. So the behavior is very clearly, and let's go back a step. This behavior came about, or these new requirements came about after the renovation, and the director of Seattle Center, Robert Nellens, wanted very badly to turn the newly renovated Center House into a sort of premier dining location. They wanted to attract new restaurants, new business. They wanted to make it more upscale. And so the idea was we can't do that if we have a lot of homeless people here. And that was really what was behind shutting off of the AC outlets. It definitely was not a cost measure because it cost, I have the emails, it cost over $2,000 just for the first run of locking covers and installing them. And then the covers are getting repeatedly broken and damaged. The electrical shop at Seattle Center can't even keep up with the maintenance. So this has been an incredibly costly thing to cover these outlets. So it wasn't done for cost. It wasn't done for safety.
And it wasn't done from costs of the electrical bills being so high.
No, because I did the calculation. I mean, these are low power outlets. You can't draw that much amperage from them, and basically people are just charging their laptops or their cell phones. And you could run hundreds of laptops for probably about 20 years on the cost that they spent just to cover the outlets. So, and the other thing that's important is they originally said the reason we're covering the outlets that we just spent thousands of dollars putting in, bizarre, but the reason we're covering those is because we want to keep in the new seating area in Seattle Center, in the food court, we want to keep that area clear for patrons, people that are actually buying food. So that's why we covered the outlets in a specific area. But that doesn't make sense because as part of that program of covering those outlets, they shut off or blocked every single outlet in the Armory, in the Seattle Center House. So they kept on saying, that's part of the reason I did the public records request, is they kept on saying things that were at odds with each other. We just want to get seating in a particular area open. Well, if you're concerned about that, why are you shutting out outlets upstairs, downstairs, and hallways?
Is there any evidence from the vendors there that the vendors asked for a help with pushing the homeless out?
No, and again, it's a curious issue. Again, the rationale was we want to make the seating available for whatever, everyone, for a broader range of people. But I spend a fair amount of time at Seattle Center. I've walked through there every few days. And even at lunchtime during the week, it's never more than about 10, 15%. I think the most I've ever seen is something approaching 20% in that new seating area, 20% of the chairs and tables occupied. So seating is not really the issue. And I think most of the vendors that are there don't have a problem. I think the problem comes, and we don't know the answer, but the problem may be that they hired one of the biggest multinational restaurateur corporations, Levy Restaurants. As part of the new renovation last year, they hired Levy Restaurants to manage the food area. So the question is raised, was this something that came from a private company that was trying to instruct Seattle Center staff as to how to maximize their profits, with no concern for how it would affect the public interest or the community commons? And that's something that I'm still looking into. Again, I haven't gotten all the documents. This has been 230 days since I requested documents, and they are still refusing to release them.
So you have a lawsuit then because they have not been forthcoming with documents, is that correct?
Right. So I initiated a lawsuit December 6th after I gave them 10 days notice that they had not given me the documents that I requested. I gave them 10 days notice, or I said I would initiate legal action. They decided to really ignore that. They released a few documents. And interesting, they kept on asking me what documents I didn't have. And that's a bit of a joke because if I told them what documents I didn't have, first of all, I can't know all the documents I don't have. But even if I told them some of the documents I knew I didn't have, then they would simply hand me those documents and say, we're done. So that's not the way public records requests work. Public records requests are you ask an agency for the documents they have, and they're supposed to turn them over. They're not supposed to play hide and go seek. They're not supposed to play a shell game with you. And Seattle Center now for 9 months has basically been doing that. And to my horror, the city law office has actually been defending that. So Pete Holmes's department is defending this ridiculous interpretation of the Public Records Act. That not only do I have to make a clear request, but then when I don't get documents, I'm supposed to tell them what's missing, which is a conundrum. So just to be very specific here and show you how simple this is. For example, when I asked for documents back in October and I got meeting notes starting with February of 2012, I got some meeting notes. And in the meeting notes, they said we're going to meet every week or every 2 weeks. And then the next set of meeting notes I got were in June. Well, what happened to the ones in March, April, and May? I mean, that's pretty obvious. It's hard to say, well, we said we were going to meet every 2 weeks, but we didn't really do it. Well, where's the email that says that? So that's the problem, is that some of these things are rather obvious. The other thing is that there are documents that I know exist because I talked to staff at Seattle Center. And this raises another issue, is that when they asked me what documents I knew were missing, I really couldn't tell them that. Because if I told them that, then I'd be giving away information that people shared with me on a privileged basis. So their responsibility is to release all the documents and not play games. And they're still doing that after 9 months.
And traditionally, when one puts in a request, you say all documents relative to this subject matter or whatever.
Right, and actually my request, this raises an interesting question. So my request had 2 parts to it, and it was very explicit. We're talking about, 200 words, very simple request. So the first part of the request was I want all information about installing AC outlets in the newly renovated area, and I want all information about purchasing of the locking covers and making decisions to cover those outlets. That was one part of the request. The second part of the request was I want all information pertaining to changing rules for behavior or changing the terms and conditions of entry for any particular group at Seattle Center. And I said that would include the homeless, the transient, whatever names you have. Any group that's singled out for unique treatment, I want to know about any discussions you had. What they decided is they would answer the first part of that request about the AC outlets and totally ignore the second part. And so despite going to Superior Court and having a hearing in front of a judge, they still refused to honor the second part of the request. And in fact, when asked in court by the judge, have you complied with Mr. Gale's request? Did you provide documents concerning transient or homeless populations? The answer that the city lawyer gave was, no, we provided information about AC outlets, and that should cover the homeless. Which is an interesting admission. It's a 2-part admission. One, it's an admission that they ignored part of my request and possibly did so intentionally. But the other interesting thing is it's an admission that the whole game with the AC outlets was really about the homeless and the transient. Why would you say, well, we answered Mr. Gale's request about AC outlets, therefore he should have all the information he needs about the homeless? So it's a 2-part admission. Yeah. One, they ignored part of the request, and 2, the whole game of shutting out the AC outlets was about restricting homeless.
And it seems to support that, and we're willing to go to bat to defend this position that we took by stating that outright.
Well, I think I think in this case, this was in court, and this was the city legal department, and I don't think they really, I think at that point, I think Seattle Center staff are trying to manage this in their own way. I don't think that the city law department really understands what Seattle Center is doing. I think the city law department or the particular lawyers that went to court are just trying to defend the city. So I don't even think they necessarily understand what the intentions are here.
Now, our city center staff, are those City of Seattle staff?
Right. So Robert Nellums is a department head, just like any other department.
Okay.
And these are civil servants.
All right. So, and there's, as far as we can tell, beyond the entity that was brought in to run the food court, then there's no other private corporations involved in this struggle so far that we know of?
No, no. And again, I don't know what the role of Levy restaurants are. That is something that I'm going to be putting another public records request in on. Again, to go back to this whole notion of what happens to the public commons, at the same time that they started shutting off the outlets and hiring Levy restaurants, another thing started happening at Seattle Center, at the Center House, which I haven't seen in 30, 40 years that I've been around. And that is all of a sudden you had people hawking, like Wyndham real estate, timeshares. You had people actually now had contracts inside the Center House to hawk stuff. And so you would enter the Center House and people would come up to you and say, excuse me, welcome to Seattle Center, and then try to sell you something. Now, this doesn't happen in any other public park. So, again, it's another example. Seattle Center seems very concerned that the homeless might bother you. I've never been bothered by a homeless person at the Center House. And yet every time I walk in now, I've been approached by Verizon people. I've been approached by Wyndham Real Estate. And sometimes they get pretty obnoxious. Sometimes they'll actually sit down at your table in the food court and not take no for an answer. And this is actually permitted, contracted behavior. So it's okay if for private profit someone comes over and bothers me, that's okay with Seattle Center. But God forbid someone should maybe come over to me, which hardly ever happens, and ask for money.
I was going to say, don't we have panhandler laws for people hawking?
There should be. And by the way, actually, but there are very clear, and there always have been. There's very clear for everyone. There's very clear behavioral conditions for hanging out in the Center House. And I think the homeless community in general does a very good job of self-enforcing. I can't remember a time when I've ever really been bothered. But there are plenty of other groups that really do bother you. The Center High School students can be really raucous and loud, both at lunchtime and after school. During certain sports events or rock concerts at the arena, there can be people drunk and loud, and that doesn't seem to bother Seattle Center. That's okay. But having homeless people sitting around playing cards, trying to look for services on their laptop, keeping their laptops plugged in, somehow that rises to the level of a concern that has to be mitigated.
I want to get back to some of the items that you've dug up from the documents that you have gained from the center. They talk about that they had meetings with homeless representatives. Who are these homeless representatives do you have any idea?
Actually, I do have their names. I don't think.
Okay.
I wouldn't.
Just wonder if it was they were representing organizations. Or...
Oh, no. Actually, no. The homeless representatives were it was a few of the homeless people that hang out there a lot, that talk a lot to the staff, that the staff knew.
Okay.
But they were not officially representing anybody. They didn't even pretend to be representing anybody. And they made very clear to Seattle Center that this was not really fair. Now, I do have to say something else here, and that is, the homeless people that spend a lot of their days in Seattle Center at the Center House or the newly labeled Armory are really not in a great position. They're thankful for everything that they can get, and I think they do have real fears that they are going to be pushed out. I mean, I think that was clear when they started shutting out the outlets and increasing the security and the rousting of people. So they're not exactly, they're not going to be complaining about these things because they already feel they're in a perilous position. And that's part of the reason that I felt, compelled to really take some kind of action here. That the Seattle Center was really bullying and taking advantage of their power over people who have no power and are in such a rotten position that they're not exactly going to complain. And I think it was thanks to Monica Guzman, who in July of 2012 did a small article in the Seattle Times. That sort of put Seattle Center on alert. And I think because of Monica's article, because Real Change had done some stuff in the summer of 2012, and because I got involved in September, October of 2012, I think as a result of that, they did end up putting in a charging station, and they did eventually reopen the AC outlets on the upper level, the level above the food court, that are in the seating area near the Center House School. So those outlets, when school is not in session, are available to use. But they've still locked out all the outlets on the main floor.
And I found out about this issue actually from an article in The Stranger this week by Sienna Madrid. So kudos to her for the coverage of this. Your documents brought out about the electrical outlets, but you also mentioned earlier about that they were looking at changing some of the behavior, the other behavior as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think they, again, I'm still, these are part of the documents that are missing. Starting in February of 2012, they wanted to have discussions with city social services, with the Seattle Police Department, with the city law office about how they could actually change the requirements for behavior at Seattle Center. And those documents are all pretty much missing. I imagine what they did is they wanted to have fairly draconian rules, and people in city government, like especially the law office, probably said, no, you really can't do that. You can't do things that are going to discriminate or target a particular population. So they changed the rules, they promulgated new rules, and they're not that different. They're fairly common sense. You can't drink alcohol. I mean, you can't do things that are illegal, basically. And it's rules for behavior, which I think we would all agree on. But what is that's not what's problematic. What is problematic is telling people that they can't lie down or they can't sleep. Is clearly, from my observations, is enforced in a very discriminative manner. So if someone looks like they're, middle class, they're left alone. If someone looks like they're homeless or they know that they're homeless, then they'll actually go over and roust them and say, if you put your head down again, we're going to have to ask you to leave.
So what are you hoping to get from the lawsuit? Is it just the documents? Is it?
Well, it's two things. It's one is the documents, that's part of it. But also, I think the city law department, I think Pete Holmes has to, he's campaigned, one of his big campaign slogans has always been about transparency. And if I could, I wanted to actually read something from last year's Supreme Court ruling in Washington State. This is Washington State Supreme Court about the Public Records Act. They said, without tools such as the Public Records Act, government of the people, by the people, for the people, risks becoming government of the people, by the bureaucrats, for the special interests. In the famous words of James Madison, quote, a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. That's from the Washington State Supreme Court, unanimous decision, April 2012. So there's a very clear and important interest in the Public Records Act and in fulfilling it. It's the only way we can hold our government officials accountable. And whether it's things like what happened to Yesler Terrace, development in Seattle, South Lake Union, any kind of public interest issues, the only way we can find out what's behind it, what's driving it, is through the Public Records Act. And so what I would like is it's not just about the AC outlets at Seattle Center. It's about Pete Holmes putting the city law office on notice that they have to fulfill public records, that they can't actually block public records requests and then be willing to go to court and waste citizen money and time trying to defend absurd interpretations of the Public Records Act.
As we've seen recently as well, a lot of expensive lawsuits can occur from this, from the city not being, city or other entity, county, you name it.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, there's a famous case, Seattle Times, where there was one particular email that was not released. And this was on a police accountability matter. One email was not released between the police department and Seattle City Council. Seattle Times had to go to court, and that ended up in I think it was a $180,000 judgment. Now, most of that money is actually not in the fines for the Public Records Act. It's actually in the legal fees. And so it's an incredible waste of taxpayer money. And I think the other thing, I know we're running out of time, but the other thing is the city law office has a conundrum, and they have irreconcilable conflict of interest. And that is, on the one half, they're supposed to fulfill the Public Records Act. They have people there that are supposed to fulfill the Public Records Act. And yet, in a case like mine, how can they do that? They're also defending the city. They're defending the Seattle Center. And they have a conflict of interest. If they really do release all the records, then they're going to prove that Seattle Center violated the PRA. So how do you defend a client when in also enforcing the law, you might reveal documents which are going to be, condemning your client? I mean, that's an impossible position to be in.
So what do you see as the solution then?
What I see in the solution is there actually is a city law that was passed a few years ago that says, the city of Seattle is going to fully comply with all aspects of the of Washington State Public Records Act, and that should be done. It shouldn't be. When I come along and say there are documents missing, the city law office shouldn't start working on day one, start working with Seattle Center to figure out how to fight my case. What they should be doing is actually contacting me and saying, okay, what's missing here? Let's see if we can, serve as intermediary and get you the records that you're asking. I mean, that's all I ever wanted. I'm not asking for, I'm just asking for all the documents that were relevant to making decisions about how to treat the homeless. I mean, it was a fairly simple request, and with computers and with most documents occurring on email, it's actually very easy to make these searches. This is not an onerous or complicated request. But instead, Seattle Center turned this into something very complicated. And then the city law department actually went to bat for them. And basically since November 20th, has been defending this kind of response, that it's okay for us to after you ask 2, 3, 4 times and we keep on finding more documents, we can just keep on giving you documents, and we're not violating the Public Records Act. That's absurd.
All right, so we are just about out of time. Is there a website or any way that people can find out more about this, follow this issue?
I think outside, if you link to the Stranger article, I put a little more information in the comments section. If you link to that Stranger article from this week, as I get more information, I'll hopefully try to post it there. Or if you have any suggestions.
All right. Well, we can do our best to keep people informed about developments in this. All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Sure. Thank you, Mike.